Well, welcome everybody to our weekly seminar, and I'm really pleased today to introduce a good friend, colleague, Dr. Chris Lowe, who's a professor of marine biology and director of the Shark Lab at California State University, Long Beach. Where Chris and his students have been working on acoustic and satellite telemetry techniques to study the movement, behavior, and physiology of sharks, rays, and game fishes. Chris has been an active scientific research diver for 30 years, logging hundreds of research dives at sharky places, including California, Hawaii, northwestern Hawaiian Islands, Palmyra Atoll, Belize, Bikini Atoll, Great Barrier Reef, and the Philippines. And Chris serves as the CSU Ocean Studies Institute and as the USC on the USC Diving Control Board. Chris earned his bachelor's degree in marine biology at Barrington College in Rhode Island, and a master's degree in marine science at California State University, Long Beach. In 1998, he earned a doctorate in zoology, studying bioenergetics of juvenile hammerhead sharks at the University of Hawaii. And in 1998, he returned to Cal State Long Beach to teach marine biology and oversee the Shark Lab, which was founded in 1966 by Dr. Don Nelson, who was a pioneer in the development and use of acoustic telemetry to study sharks. It's been Dr. Lowe's goal to maintain the history of innovation that Dr. Nelson established. And for the last 10 years, Chris and his students have been studying baby and juvenile white sharks off Southern California and have contributed greatly to the field of knowledge of energetics in the species. In addition, recent research by Chris and his team has focused on the development of underwater robots for autonomously tracking sharks and game fishes. He's garnered several academic awards, including CSU Long Beach's 2008-2009 Outstanding Professor Award, the 2012 Cal State Long Beach Impact and Research Award, and 2016 the Nell and John Wooden Ethics and Leadership Award. He's also recognized by the Orange County Registers among the top 100 most influential people. As the climate, ocean, and marine life continue to change, Dr. Lowe has become adept at speaking to the media about how fluctuations in water temperature and weather patterns have affected ocean life. He's appeared in many articles and on TV and radio broadcasts, including PBS, BBC, special Big Blue Live today, Al Jazeera America, CBC News, Newsweek, KNX Radio, the Orange County Register, the LA Times, the Long Beach Press and Telegraph, just to name a few. Chris grew up in Martha's Vineyard, where he spent his majority of his youth fishing and diving in the waters around Cape Cod. Comes from a long line of New England fishermen and whalers, and is the first in his family to go to college. And he believes a career focused on the marine environment was inevitable. And just before I let Chris get started here, I just want to go over the etiquette for today. All participants will be muted throughout the seminar. Please do not attempt to turn on your video or share your screen during the talk. There'll be an opportunity afterwards for the audience to ask questions live at the end of Chris's talk, just like a normal seminar. Once the speakers finish their talk, you can use Zoom to raise your hand and notify the host if you'd like to ask a question. Anyway, and with that, I'd like to introduce Chris, who will be speaking here. Chris, thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for the invite. It's always great to be able to talk to my Moss Landing Marine Lab colleagues and share some of the work that we've been doing. So actually, the story I'm going to share with you today is kind of an interesting one, and it's one that has been about a 16-year journey. So interestingly enough, we've been working on this project for quite a long time, and it's kind of an interesting story that's kind of changed my perspective on conservation. So, you know, the bottom line is we think of white sharks as kind of that iconic, let's see if I can get my screen to work here. There we go. As that iconic species that you recognize on television that everybody's familiar with. And you know, historically, it's been the Discovery Channel darling. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that there are white shark populations all around the world, that research has really exploded, I would say, in the last 20 years. And interestingly enough, it seems like there are more sharks to study. And that's something that kind of got me interested in this particular project I'll be talking about today. So the bottom line is, as best we know, white sharks have been impacted in the Northeast Pacific for probably well over 100 years. They've been interacting in commercial fisheries throughout the Northeast Pacific, where particularly the young ones have been caught, killed, and landed in fisheries. And chances are, if you ate fish tacos in California up into the 90s, you had white shark and you might not even know them. So the bottom line is, it's likely that white shark populations have been depressed for over 100 years, not just because of fishing pressure, and a bulk of that fishing pressure really occurred in the 70s through the 90s, but more likely attributed to the fact that a predominance of their adult food source had been hunted to the verge of extinction. So most marine mammals, pinnipeds and great whales, had been hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s, and it wasn't until 1972 that we saw protection for marine mammals nationally that allowed populations to start to recover. So these lines that I show here are fictitious lines. They really don't indicate actual population size. We don't have a good handle on historic white shark population size, but we predict that the population was depressed because of lack of adult food and juvenile food, and because of fishing pressure. And then in the mid-90s, we saw protection for white sharks in California, despite the fact that they were implicated in attacks and even deaths of humans. And as a result, if fishers caught them, they were required to release them. In addition, in 1994, the state of California banned the use of nearshore gillnets, and we think that was instrumental in allowing the population to begin to recover. So it was recovery of its adult food resource and also protection of white sharks that has probably allowed white sharks to come back. And I put stingrays here because stingrays are an important food item, particularly for the juveniles. So what do we know about white shark population? So particularly in Southern California, juvenile white sharks have been landed in commercial fisheries, and there's good data for that. Pete Klimley found in a paper that he published in 1985 from historic fishing records throughout California that Southern California was likely a nursery for white sharks, and that was based predominantly on fishing records. And then we followed up with another study in 2012. So if we look at fishing capture records, so these are from the two gillnet fisheries, an offshore drift gillnet fishery targeting swordfish and shark, and then an inshore set and drift gillnet fishery targeting halibut, angel shark, and white sea bass. We can see that these two fisheries reached their peak in the mid-80s, and then they start to decline. So these indicate the number of nets set per year for the two fisheries. The bars indicate the number of juvenile white sharks reported caught in those fisheries. So blue bars are young of the year, green bars are juveniles, yellow bars are adults, and I think red bars are adults, and green bars are unknowns. So what you can see is the number of individuals being reported caught in fisheries peak around 1985, and then the reported captures start to decline as the fishery is being regulated and also in decline. But after 1994, we can see that gillnet fishing is still occurring, but it's outside 3 miles, outside state waters. And it was after about 2005 that we really started to see an increase in the number of white sharks being reported caught as bycatch in that fishery. So for some, this could be an indication of population increase in that you're seeing more juveniles being caught in the remaining fishery. So we saw an 82% reduction in gillnet fishing since the mid-1980s. In addition, we've seen many marine mammals which are also interacting with those gillnet fisheries. So remember I told you that many species of pinnipeds were hunted pretty much to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. Northern elephant seals have shown a remarkable recovery over the last 30 or 40 years. Same with harbor seals. Since their protection in 1972, we've seen harbor seal populations come up and kind of plateau. And it's really California sea lions that have shown remarkable recovery, with population estimates anywhere between 212 and 400,000 animals in their range. And even the southern sea otter has shown pretty remarkable recovery throughout its southern range. So remember, all of these three species are important prey items for adult white sharks. Sea otter is not necessarily an important prey item, but an interesting indicator of white shark abundance. So basically what we've seen over the last 20 years is that in Southern California in particular, there have been an increase in sightings of juvenile white sharks along Southern California beaches. In fact, based on Lifeguard records, there are 5 times more sightings that occur in the last 10 years. In addition, we have some of the most heavily populated coastline in the world. In fact, 20 million people between Santa Barbara and San Diego all live within 60 miles of the coast, and many of them enjoy year-round ocean recreation for surfing, swimming, stand-up paddleboarding, surf fishing, spearfishing, all those sorts of things. So as a result, we have a heavily populated coastline in which we have a lot of white sharks interacting with them. So this increase in white shark population along these really crowded beaches has resulted in more beach closures out of safety protocols by the lifeguards, particularly in the last 10 years. So as a result, we've seen more and more interactions. However, with those interactions, we haven't necessarily seen more people being bitten. In fact, a study published a few years ago has indicated that the per capita rate has actually decreased in the last 50 years. So despite the fact that there are more people and more sharks interacting in Southern California waters, when somebody does get bitten, this does result in a lot of media hype, which has resulted in economic impacts in many of our coastal communities. In addition, water safety officials, mainly lifeguards, harbor patrol, they're the ones responsible for making management decisions based on public safety, particularly when there are white sharks along the coast. And they, in general, have lacked information about what these white sharks are doing and whether they pose a risk or a threat to people. So what do we know about white shark distribution and seasonality? So even back to 1985, Pete Klimley was convinced that Southern California was a nursery based on catch records from a commercial fishery, particularly between the months of April and October. And what we've identified since then is that historically there are these hotspots off Santa Barbara, Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, Long Beach, Huntington Beach, Dana Point, and San Diego County. So all these areas were known to have juvenile white sharks captured in the gillnet fishery during its heyday. The other thing that we've learned is that typically these juveniles are here during the spring and summer months into the early fall, but typically adult white sharks are seen along the Central California coast, starting around September through about February. And then also around in Southern California, we typically see them around the offshore islands, the Channel Islands and Catalina, but we rarely see them along Southern California beaches. So since we've been tagging since 2010, this is the size frequency distribution of sharks that we've tagged since then. And what you'll notice is a vast majority of these sharks are what we consider young of the year. They're below 175 centimeters total length. And in recent years, we've been seeing more and more larger juveniles using the same nursery habitats. I'm going to talk more about that. So in order to quantify their movements and their behavior, we've been using a variety of technologies, including spot tags, which get bolted on the dorsal fin. We use pop-off archiving satellite tags, which measure temperature, light, and depth. And then these are designed to pop off the shark, float to the surface, and then we can get the data back. And then we have acoustic transmitters that we can either surgically implant into the sharks, and those tags have an 8 to 10 year battery life. Or if the sharks are too large for us to handle, we can simply dart an acoustic transmitter into the shark's back, and those have about a 1 to 3 year battery life. Now, we have acoustic receivers all along the coast. These acoustic receivers can listen in 360 degrees. So when a shark swims within about 200 or 300 meters of one of the receivers, the receiver will log the time, the date, and the ID number. So we have about 100 receivers spread from Morro Bay all the way down to the Mexican border, all around the Channel Islands and Catalina. And most of the ones along the coastline are literally about 100 meters off the beach. In addition, we also have been using something called smart tags, and I'll talk more about those later. And they give us really high resolution information about the behavior of these sharks. So in order to get tags on or in these animals, we've used a variety of techniques. Now, in our early days of doing this work in collaboration with Monterey Bay Aquarium, we relied on commercial gillnet fishermen that were fishing outside 3 miles. And if they incidentally caught a shark in their nets, they would call us up, we would meet the fishermen at the dock, we could assess the shark, take measurements, take blood, tissue samples for genetics. We could affix the sharks with a variety of different transmitter technologies, take them offshore and let them go. Now, unfortunately, getting data from fishermen was not consistent because they weren't always catching sharks. And even when they did, sometimes they didn't want to waste the time bringing them in. So in some cases, we would attempt to catch the sharks ourselves. Or if the sharks were too large, we could simply dart tag it, a pat tag or an acoustic transmitter into the shark's back. And in some cases, the sharks are so close to shore that we couldn't get a boat of this size in that close to the beach. So we'd use Lifeguard jet skis and our small Boston whaler to deploy a piece of gillnet right in front of the sharks using a drone or a helicopter to spot for us. The sharks would be entangled in the nets. We could quickly grab that shark, remove it from the net, and then process it much like we would if we got it from a commercial fisherman. The other technique, and this is the one that my grad students love the most, is because the sharks are very close to the wave break, we would put them on the back of a Lifeguard jet ski, and then we'd use a helicopter or drone to spot. When they could see the shark, they could roll into the water, and we could dart a tag in the shark's back. So using this technique, because we would have these small aggregations of sharks in along these beach areas, it was possible for us to tag up to 5 or 6 of these animals in just a couple hours. To give you an indication of how shallow the shark is, this student is standing. So this is basically about waist deep water. So one of the questions we wanted to answer was, for the sharks caught in the gillnet fishery, what happens to those sharks after they're released? Do they survive being caught in a gillnet? So here's a juvenile young of the year white shark being handled by a commercial fisherman. This indicates the size of the fish totes that they quite often bring them back in. And here's a shark being released. And here's a juvenile white shark in a live well with some legal sized California halibut. The other question we want to answer is, what is the degree of fishing interaction? So how much gillnet fishing interaction is there occurring outside 3 miles based on where the sharks are going? And is the fishing practice, is there a way to reduce its interaction or reduce post-release mortality based on how fishers are fishing? So again, here we are processing a white shark that was brought in by commercial fishers, and all this research was funded and supported by Monterey Bay Aquarium. So I had a grad student, Katie Lyons, that did a study where we looked at all the commercial gillnet fishing in Southern California. This indicates state waters, this gray line you see here. And the squares indicate the Department of California Fish and Game fishing blocks. So the redder the square, the greater the amount of fishing hours in those time periods. And this is between 2006 and 2009. And then the symbols indicate the locations where our commercial fishing partners had caught sharks. So as you can see, a lot of the fishing is occurring right along state waters, particularly in this area off Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, and Long Beach, Huntington Beach, Dana Point. When we compare that to the locations of where our spot tag sharks were detected, so the white symbols indicate detections inside 3 miles where no gillnet fishing is allowed. The black symbols indicate detections of sharks outside 3 miles where gillnet fishing occurs. So the first thing you'll notice is that not all spot tag detections are occurring in the places with the greatest amount of red, where the greatest amount of gillnet fishing is occurring. In fact, 44% of all detections occurred inside state waters in fairly close to shore. Now, this technology doesn't give you a super accurate measurement of their geoposition all the time. Sometimes it can be off by 1 kilometer or more. So what's really interesting about this is there is fishery interaction. That's how we got the sharks to tag. But we found that a lot of sharks, for example, that were caught and tagged off Ventura spent a lot more time during this time period off Santa Monica Bay, at least during these years. So they're not always spending all their time in blocks where there's a lot of gillnet fishing interaction. So there's clearly interaction, but not so much as to create a serious problem. In addition, the other interesting thing that we found from looking at fishing records is that there was a higher likelihood of juvenile white sharks being caught in gillnets that had very few target species, halibut and white sea bass on those sets. So this is kind of interesting because one thing you might hypothesize is that white sharks are being attracted to the nets through depredation and therefore then getting entangled. But this suggests that they're mostly interacting with the nets when there aren't target species in the nets. In addition, we found for sharks that were found alive in the gillnets from the fishermen, based on our pop-off satellite tag data, 94% of those sharks survived. And we have data from those that we tagged with acoustic tags being detected for up to 7 years after being caught in a gillnet. Now, John Benson, who was a postdoc at Monterey Bay Aquarium, did some really nice work working up some of our PAT tag data and was able to come up with a survival rate of 0.63% for juveniles in their first year, and estimated the natural mortality to 0.08%, which is what you'd expect for a really big baby, right? So in addition, we found that fishing mortality decreased as the sharks got larger, as they get older, but there was greater fishing mortality in Mexican waters than there were in US waters. In addition, of those sharks that were found live or dead, we began to ask fishers why some years there were a higher likelihood of sharks being found dead in the nets. And one of the things we found was when the fishers were out looking for fish, sometimes they would leave their nets out for 2 days. And there was a much higher likelihood of a shark being found dead in the net if they left their net out for more than 40 hours. But if they checked their nets in less than 24 hours, there was a very high likelihood of the shark being found live in the net. So this actually gave those fishers important data that suggests if they check their nets more frequently, they can significantly reduce shark mortality. So now I want to show you some of the tag data and some of the interpretation. So this is an animation of sharks that we caught and tagged with those spot tags. These are the ones that get bolted on the fin, and when the fin breaks the surface, we can get a latitude and longitude, but it only works when the shark is at the surface. So the colors you're going to see are the colors of the sharks. Here is a March, here's a month, and a Julian date. So what you can see here is that sharks tagged during the summer months, quite often in the winter, migrate down to Baja. You'll start to see this as we get into subsequent years. So here we can see during the summer, they're hanging out in Southern California. But as we get to the fall, we start to see these southerly migrations down to this area called Vizcaino Bay and occasionally into the Sea of Cortez. So to give you two really interesting examples, this is one from a shark that was young of the year caught in Ventura in 2007. And what you're going to see is a date counter here, and then daily sea surface temperature will be here. So this is from sharks that were tagged with pop-off satellite tags. So the geo position, the estimate position, is going to be this black smudge right here. So now what you're going to see is during the summer, when the water is warm in Southern California, we're going to see this shark hanging out in Southern California. But when we get to October, you can see this slug of green water indicating the water temperature is dropping. And that seemed to be a cue for most of the sharks that we tagged during those summers to drive them south to this area around Vizcaino Bay. And this is where most of the tags popped off in January and February. So what this indicated to us is that water temperature, particularly cooler water, seemed to be a cue to initiate the southerly migration. Now we had an opportunity to do a really cool experiment the same year. So this was another young of the year shark caught off Ventura, but this shark was brought to Monterey Bay Aquarium and kept on exhibit there for 5 months and released in Monterey in February. So now I'll show you this animation. So you can see that the water temperatures in Monterey are pretty cold. And this shark pretty much makes a beeline all the way down to Mazatlan. And here in April, you can see this slug of warm water that comes up from the equator and drives into the Gulf. So this sea surface temperature is actually driving the shark up into the Sea of Cortez. And then right before the tag popped off, that shark was hanging out at a depth of about 30 meters, where the water temperature was more like 17 degrees C, which is more like Southern California summer temperatures. So we had a couple of sharks that exhibited that behavior. And what that showed us was that water temperature was an important cue to initiate migration. But it's not just colder temperatures, it's also warmer temperatures. So Connor White, who was one of my graduate students, used our spot tag data and was able to look at those data and develop a series of GAMs. And what he found from the GAMs was that water temperature, daily sea surface temperature, distance from shore, and the depth at which a geo position was recorded for the spot tag were the three most important environmental variables in predicting habitat suitability for juvenile white sharks. So he was able to run multi-year models that predicted where you would expect to find juvenile white sharks. So in the winter months, these areas along Baja and the Gulf were preferable habitat. But in the summer months, Southern California up to about Point Conception, except during the strong El Nino in 2015, where his model predicted that sharks should move north, and they did. In fact, they were found all the way up in Monterey and Santa Cruz. So this model accurately predicts the movements, particularly of young of the year and juvenile white sharks, small juvenile white sharks. If we really want to know how much time sharks are spending off beaches, we used our acoustic telemetry arrays to measure this. So these dots indicate our acoustic receiver locations in Southern California. We are partners with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, which has an array of receivers around the Channel Islands. We have a large array around Catalina. So these indicate institutions that we collaborate with in Southern California. In addition, we have collaborators at Monterey Bay Aquarium and Stanford University that also share data using the same technology. And then I have collaborators in Mexico that have acoustic receiver arrays in Vizcaino Bay and at Guadalupe Island. So based on this, we've found that many of the sharks that we've tagged in Southern California, by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, have made migrations all the way up to Santa Cruz and Monterey, all the way down to Vizcaino Bay, to Guadalupe Island, to the Channel Islands, and have done this in multiple years based on this technology. So the other thing that we found that's really interesting is that in Southern California, there are these hotspots that the fishery also indicated dating back for 50 or 60 years. So off Santa Barbara, Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, Long Beach, Huntington Beach, Dana Point, and San Diego. Based on our acoustic tagging data, we have also supported this hotspot phenomenon, but what's really interesting is the hotspots change from one year to the next. So you can see in 2010, Santa Monica Bay was the hotspot. In 2011, Palos Verdes, but we didn't have that many sharks tagged. 2012, Santa Monica Bay. So for 2 or 3 years, this area right here was the hotspot. And then what happened was in 2015 and 16, this area of Long Beach and Huntington Beach became the hotspot. We detected a few sharks in Santa Monica, but very few in Santa Barbara, Dana Point, and San Diego. And this year, Santa Barbara and San Diego were the hotspot. So we have a paper right now that's in review that is detailing these hotspot phenomena and how it is somewhat related to annual conditions, but not necessarily seasonal temperature. So the next animation I'm going to show you are detections for 2020. These are all the sharks that we have tagged with active tags that were detected. So what you'll see is a time and date counter here. So you can see that in February, these sharks are moving back and forth between Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo or the Channel Islands. And then we start getting into the summer where we started to tag more young of the year white sharks. We can see a lot of activity between Santa Barbara, moving between Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo. And then we had sharks moving between the Channel Islands, moving down to Santa Monica Bay, to Dana Point, all the way down to San Diego. So in 2020, we were able to track almost 40 different individuals throughout the summer, making movements throughout all of Southern California and rounding the corner and even going further north beyond Point Conception. Of course, the individuals that we found going north of Point Conception were all larger than 2 meters. So one of the challenges that we have is that our goal is to give lifeguards information about when tagged sharks are off their beaches. Unfortunately, it takes us about a month to download all the receivers that we have throughout Southern California. So by the time we got data to lifeguards at a beach, we would say, oh, 2 weeks ago, there was a 3-meter shark detected off your beach. And they'd go, well, that doesn't help us now. So in order to provide them with real-time data, we developed these buoys in collaboration with the manufacturer. So we have a buoy now that has an acoustic receiver underneath the buoy, and then it has a cell modem and a GPS on it, so it knows where it is. It's moored in location, and anytime a tagged shark swims within 200 or 300 meters of the buoy, it will send a cell signal to the cloud, and then lifeguards, who are our clients, can get real-time text alerts from tagged sharks in that area. So right now, we have this only available to water safety personnel, but in the future, we hope to make these data available to the public. So we have 4 buoys currently off Southern California. We have 1 off Santa Barbara, 1 off Long Beach, 1 off Huntington Beach, and 1 off Dana Point. There's software that the company produces that gives you information. So this is from the summer. This is a buoy that we had off Santa Barbara. And here you can see all the sharks being detected at a time. You can click on one of these and we'll give you all the detailed information about that individual. So when we look at detection data, this is what we call an abacus plot. So on this axis, we have date and time. And on this axis, we have just different individuals that we had tagged that were being detected by the buoy. So this is one buoy. We have a big acoustic receiver array out at this beach, but you can see these clear day-night patterns of when the shark is passing by the buoy. But other sharks are showing different patterns, spending more time particularly along that area where the buoy was. The nice thing about this technology is the lifeguards are able to see this in real time. So one of the questions we often get, and one of the ones we've been asking ourselves, is why are these young sharks in so close to shore? And why do they form these aggregations? So to answer these questions, we've formulated 3 hypotheses. So one reason why we think they're coming in so close to shore is because this is a safe place. These sharks are born live. We don't know where birthing has occurred, but this may be the safest place for them because there are fewer predators in the shallow water along our beaches. In addition, in places like Mexico, there are large lagoons and bays, but in Southern California, they've all been developed. So it may be that only safe habitat is along the coastline. The other thing is, if they're going to hang out here to avoid predation, then there has to be adequate food. And because they're naive predators, that food has to be easily abundant, has to be readily abundant and easy to capture. The number one thing we find in young white shark stomachs are stingrays, and we have lots of those in Southern California, particularly right along the beaches. And then our third hypothesis is that the water is warmer close to the shore than it is further offshore. And therefore, this area in close to the shoreline is what constitutes a good nursery for these white sharks. So to test these hypotheses, when these aggregations of juvenile white sharks form, we've been employing a variety of new technologies. So we fly drone surveys along the beach so that we can count and measure the size of those sharks and estimate densities. We can deploy an acoustic receiver array where we have a bunch of receivers about 300 or 400 meters apart from each other. And we can tag a bunch of sharks in this area. And then if a shark is detected within this array, instead of just getting a detection by receiver, we can actually trilaterate a position. So we can get a geoposition for each one of these tagged sharks. Now, one of the reasons why we think they're exhibiting this behavior is they're cueing to environmental conditions or to prey. So to document that, we're using an autonomous underwater vehicle, an AUV, looks like a little torpedo, equipped with a full sensor suite on its nose. And then we can have that move or basically run surveys up and down along the beach, and it's oscillating up and down through the water column as it travels. And then we can use that to measure temperature, salinity, turbidity, DO, chlorophyll, depth. It's got video cameras on it, so we can videotape the seafloor and what's in the water column to look for prey. And then our acoustic receiver array gives us a high resolution position of those animals as they move through that area. So in addition, we've done some smart tag tracks and we're using eDNA, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. So this summer, we had a large aggregation form off Santa Barbara, and we were managed to tag 35 juvenile white sharks at this site between March and January of this year. Here are locations of a really high resolution acoustic receiver array that we put in place. And the size of the bubbles tell you something about the number of detections. So you can see along this beach, which is only about 2.5 kilometers long, we had a lot of shark activity moving back and forth along this area. Here is the abacus plot. These are the times and dates. On this axis, these are just different sharks that were detected during some of that time period. And you can see basically some of these sharks are spending both day and night within this receiver array. And then here's a temperature plot from our AUV that we were running surveys through that area, and we did 9 surveys. It takes about 8 hours to run a complete environmental survey through the array. And then all our acoustic receivers have temperature sensors on them. So this is an indication of 1 day's temperature variability at this site. So what you can see is that our temperature, seafloor temperature data shows us where the rip currents are from this beach and the cool spots that occur over the course of the tide. So we were able to see and document basically almost 8 degrees C change in seafloor temperature over the course of a day at this site. Now, the next animation I'm going to show you is from some of the sharks that we tagged and tracked at this location off Santa Barbara. And remember, this is only about a 2.5 kilometer stretch. The red dots indicate the receiver locations. This one is our buoy. So what you're going to see is a time and date counter here. And this is only for August 31st through September 4th. We have data spanning from March all the way to December. So all these colors that you're going to see are different sharks that were detected. And as you can see, these sharks basically swim back and forth along this coastline, occasionally moving outside the array. But as you can see by different times of day, whether it be day or night, they're spending a lot of time moving back and forth in these areas. And we're in the process of now layering these data over top of our high resolution environmental data to see why periodically do they aggregate in this part of the cove. And of course, we have 7 months of data to look at. So one of the other tools that we've been using to get higher resolution information about what these sharks are doing is something we call smart tags. So this is a device developed by one of my grad students, Connor White. And this is basically a little backpack that clamps onto the shark's dorsal fin. It has a 3D accelerometer, a 3D gyroscope, and a 3D magnetometer that's recording those parameters 30 times a second. It's got a depth sensor and a water temperature sensor. It's got an acoustic transmitter on the package so we can track that shark from a boat or using one of our autonomous robots. And it's got a video logger. So this clamps on the dorsal fin and peaks down to the head so we can actually see what the shark sees, and we can record up to about 12 hours of video. And then there's a galvanic release on the back of this that allows it to pop off and float to the surface so we can recover it about 24 hours to 48 hours later. So here's some data from 3 of the sharks that we tracked off Belmont Shore a few years ago. So you can see we get really detailed depth data. Here's compass heading data. OBDA is overall body dynamic action. So this tells us activity basically. So you can see there are periods when the shark is really active and periods when it's just kind of cruising. Tail beat amplitude, tail beat frequency, and water temperature. What was really interesting though is when we were looking at the video, we saw basically it looked like the video had been cantered to a 45-degree. And we thought maybe the shark had banged the camera. But after 20 minutes, the camera tilted the other way. And it wasn't until we started looking at the heading data and the acceleration data that we began to realize that 2 of the 3 of these sharks would spend time swimming in a bank in a 30-foot diameter circle. And they would do that for 20 minutes. And these circles would drift over space, over depth, and over time. But after 20 minutes, they would reverse and go the opposite direction. And they would do that for 20 minutes and then reverse and go the opposite direction. So we kept seeing this reversal in this pattern. So my grad students started getting really excited about this. I thought the equipment was malfunctioning, but turns out birds, marine mammals, many of these species that migrate continuously or in the water will actually turn off half their brain and will fly in a circle in one direction and then turn off the other half of their brain and fly in a circle in the other direction. So migratory birds are known to do this. Dolphins and marine mammals will also do that, turn off half their brain and use the other half to pay attention. So white sharks are obligate ramp ventilators, meaning they continuously swim in order to breathe. And this may be some of the first data that exhibits how these animals at least mentally rest. So in addition to our tagging and tracking data, we've also been running drone surveys along the entire Southern California coast. This is my graduate student, Patrick Rex. He's been flying these surveys, and the purpose of the surveys are to not only trying to count and estimate densities of sharks and estimate their size, but more importantly, count how many people are in the water. Believe it or not, we have no idea how many people actually go in the water in Southern California. So by using drones and flying these surveys, he's able to basically count the number of water users, measure their distance from the shoreline and their distance from the wave break, and the same thing for sharks. So far he's run over 600 surveys and basically over 2 complete years. And we have a lot of partners that also help us collect drone survey data. So here's a drone survey image of a couple of swimmers here. Here's a juvenile white shark. So basically what he's doing here, you'll see the drone survey cruising along, the camera's in an orthogonal position, and then we can use machine learning technology to go and identify these targets and then measure their distance from the wave break and from the shoreline. So in addition, we're correlating all the geopositions of all these objects, surfers, swimmers, stand-up paddleboarders, waders, sharks, to these environmental conditions by geolocation. So Patrick is now working with computer programmers that help develop these machine learning algorithms to recognize these objects. And that way we can actually store these data in tabular form. And then of course, one of the things that he's found, which is really interesting, was we actually found a COVID effect. So in 2019, this is the average number of water user counts at the same months for the same number of days between March and May. And here is 2000. So we can see that there's actually, believe it or not, an increased number of people in the water during COVID shutdown. What was really interesting is we saw a lot more sharks this year. So there was a lot more shark interactions with people, even though there weren't negative interactions, they were people and sharks in the water at the same place. So there was a COVID effect, but believe it or not, it was the opposite of what you think. There were more people in the water during COVID than you would predict. Some of his summary data so far indicate that sharks are typically seen about 100 meters outside the wave break on average. So this is this is the median, there's the mean. And then here are your different water user groups. So not surprisingly, stand-up paddlers, surfers, and swimmers are the ones most likely to interact with white sharks, juvenile white sharks in particular. Bodyboarders and waders are inside the wave break. And as you can see, it's very rare or under very low surf conditions do we see white sharks moving into that particular habitat. In addition, we've been developing white shark eDNA technology. So a couple of years ago, we published a paper with Kevin Lafferty based on some work that we did at Santa Barbara, where we had a bunch of juvenile white sharks tagged at a location, and we were flying drone surveys. We were able to see and detect those sharks daily. We came down and took some water samples from this location just outside the surf and these down current locations. And these are areas where we never saw detected white sharks. And lo and behold, the only places we were able to measure measurable amounts of white shark DNA were at the locations where we were detecting them on that day. So this summer, we conducted a little calibration study. So we had about 15 juvenile white sharks tagged at the same location. The white dots indicate locations where we took water samples. The gray area indicates detections for white sharks. And then these are the actual receiver locations, and the bubbles indicate the number of detections during the time that we water sampled. This indicates the amount of DNA, white shark eDNA hits that we got. So what's really interesting is we got a pattern that really focused around our greatest sampling area. And our outer sites, which we clearly determined weren't far enough away, we got virtually no hits. So what this indicates is that this area, likely the current was heading in this direction, and therefore we were able to detect a predominance of white shark DNA in this area. So we've conducted since another study to further expand our calibration of not just where white sharks are based on our detection data, but also from our AUV data with water sampling. So what we've been seeing for the last 15 years is simply an increased number of sharks along our coast. And as a result of that protection, we're actually starting to see some new conservation challenges. For example, even though it is illegal for fishers to target white sharks, we have seen a significant increase in recreational fisher catch of white sharks. We know of at least 8 fishing mortalities over the last few years, and at least 30 incidents have been recorded off social media. In addition, many of these fishers that are fishing off beaches and piers are chumming, which is not illegal in California. It's stupid, but it's not illegal. And remember, there are kids swimming and playing in this water. And in some cases, fishers are putting in hundreds of pounds of ground up tuna as chum to lure these sharks in. So obviously, the enforcement for this is very difficult because many of these white sharks are supposedly released alive, but we have no idea whether those sharks can survive that. In addition, we've seen an increase in unregulated tourism where these aggregations form. We'll get party boats taking people out, 6-packs, taking people out to see the sharks. Quite often they're in very close to the shore, and in some cases they're chumming or baiting the sharks close to the boats. There are no rules or guidelines for people, and therefore this may not be a bad thing, but unregulated, it can result in potentially somebody getting hurt. So in addition to our research program, we also receive funding from the state to increase our public outreach. And one of our outreach programs are called Shark Shacks. These we run during the summer. We hit all the public beaches and piers. My undergrads, grad students, high school interns, and volunteers man these Shark Shacks. And we talk to the public about beach safety. So we talk about sharks and stingrays and sea jellies, pollution, sick marine mammals. And unfortunately not last summer because of COVID, but the summer before, we were able to engage about 7,000 people. And basically we do all sorts of events along the coast. In addition, as part of our outreach program, we've come up with a beach safety comic book for kids. So this was designed for kind of junior lifeguard age kids between 9 and 12. One is called Beach Days Save the Waves, and it teaches kids about beach safety, about rip currents, sharks, stingrays, sea jellies, pretty much all the dangerous marine life. It's kind of a fun book for kids. In addition, because it was so popular, we developed one on marine pollution. And just recently, we've translated both of these books to Spanish. At the beginning next week, all of these books will be available online for free. So because we work very closely with all the lifeguards in Southern California, and they're really on the front lines interacting with the public, we've developed an education program for them. Many of our lifeguards are some of the best in the world. However, they're not marine biologists. So many of them are not trained to identify a lot of marine life. So we've helped them to develop a marine ID program so that they can basically identify different species, because if a surfer comes in saying, I saw a white shark off the beach, they're required to investigate. And they have to be able to get information from them to be able to identify the shark. And then also their protocols for closing a beach are based on the shark's behavior. So they also have to be able to interpret behavior. So we've developed a whole education program for lifeguards throughout California on how to identify shark behavior and marine life. And we've developed a variety of basic public web-friendly social media products for them to share on their websites or via their social media. In addition, because fishers are interacting with these sharks, we've developed a fisher education program. We have a PSA. If you take a photo of this our QR code, you'll be able to take you right straight to the video. But we have a problem with fishers either unintentionally catching white sharks or deliberately catching white sharks. So we have an education program teaching them how to avoid the capture of these sharks, best practices on to safely release the sharks and protect themselves, and signage for beach piers and coastal piers to keep people safe when they're fishing. And of course, right now we're working with the state in developing new regulations. So this work requires a huge number of partners. Monterey Bay Aquarium was the one who got us started with this research back in 2006 and had funded us ever since. We were fortunate to get funding from the state of California in 2018. We have 3 more years of funding to support this work. And we received considerable funding from private donors. We have a wide range of research and education partners. And note I say so far because we're still getting more partners. And these are all the beach cities in Southern California that have provided hundreds of thousands of dollars of in-kind support. So with that, hopefully I can answer any of your questions.
Great, that was an awesome talk, Chris. Really enjoyed that. Do you have any questions for Chris? Anyone?
James, I guess. James, get his hand up.
Oh, not seeing any.
I see a hand.
Okay, James, go ahead.
Hi, Chris. Great talk. I was curious about the lifeguard education and how deeply involved you've been in their decision criteria for closing beaches and what the decisions are and how you navigated the kind of challenges there.
Yeah, so we've been working with the lifeguard chiefs throughout California for 7 years. So we started working on a protocol, a statewide protocol, 5 years ago. And we try to use our best available scientific data, and it's already changing. But based on that, we help them develop protocols and basically, you know, a system for deciding based on size and based on behavior when beach signs should be put up, signage should be put up, and when people should be pulled out of the water and for how long. We're hoping that as our research advances, that we're going to be able to come back and modify those protocols again. But it took 5 years to get that implemented. It wasn't easy, but now all the lifeguards in the entire state of California are following the same protocols.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, Jim was next. Jim? There.
Thank you. All right, somebody finally unmuted me. Hey, Chris, it's Jim.
Hey, Jim.
My question is, from the camera data, do you have any very much information on prey capture, especially as it relates to stingrays? I'm just curious how they go about catching stingrays.
Actually, we do have a lot of footage of that. The round stingrays are usually buried in the sand, and we can see them rush in, and then you'll see stingrays scatter. When the water's clear, we can easily see that. And then you see them you can clearly see when they've got one because you'll see them kind of pin it down and then you see the head shake. But there are so many round stingrays in some of these areas that the entire area around it turns muddy from all the rays in that area scattering when the sharks come in. A lot of times they'll swim right over top of them and we don't see them flush, but it seems like the stingrays know when the shark is charging. Bat rays, however, we have seen them take down bat rays and they'll chase them down. So, bat rays will flush earlier than the round stingrays. And we've actually seen at least one bat ray get chased down. And sometimes they'll even come up into the water column.
And yeah, just to follow up is, what would be the secondary prey in the shallow water?
So that's a study that we're doing right now. I didn't talk about that. We just started a stable isotope and fatty acid study. So I have a new grad student who's taking muscle biopsies and blood. And then she'll be sampling, we're going to be doing beach seines and otter trawls along these areas and then sampling prey to see if we can't use a good mixing model to tease out more clearly what they're eating. And then we just started a new technique of cloacal swabbing and looking for, eDNA of prey. So those are our new techniques that we're hope to be able to get at. And then I have another new grad student that will be coming in looking at prey densities in these areas. So he'll be using more of the traditional sampling methods plus BRUVs in these areas to try to come up with what our prey densities are. Other than stingrays, those are the only things that we've found in the 40 stomachs that we've done analysis on for necropsies.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Montisha was next.
Hi, thank you. Really fascinating presentation. So I am totally a lay person. I'm somebody who really enjoys amateur bodyboarding. And so my question is just based on what you mentioned about the distance from wave break and the different recreational activities, was a little hard for me to follow as a layperson. So is it fair to say that like in shallow water, white sharks are less likely to go, or how would you best explain that to a layperson?
Well, so the main purpose of that graph was to show which water user groups interact the most. And right now, the grad student that's working on that study is doing a lot more detailed analysis because the topography of the beach, the tide, all that matters in terms of the wave break and its distance from the wave break to the shoreline. So the goal is he'll be doing a really kind of fine scale spatial analysis, including all those environmental variables, so that we can predict what water user groups are more likely to encounter white sharks based on actual data. So that was a very coarse summary of those data. The bottom line is, when the surf is down, we see more swimmers, more stand-up paddleboarders further offshore, and they're more likely to be in that zone where the sharks are. In addition, those juvenile white sharks are moving in closer to the beach when the swell is down. So in many ways, the juvenile white sharks are acting like round stingrays. When the swell is down, they come in as close. We've seen them in 3 feet of water. So, when the swell is up, they're typically outside the wave break. But I've had plenty of surfers send me video footage of them dropping in on a white shark on a wave. So they're in the surf zone, just not a lot.
Thank you.
That I don't know if that answered your question very clearly. Stay tuned. We'll have more.
Good. All right. I think that June was next. Had a question, June?
Hey, Chris, that was such a great presentation. I loved seeing those data on the migration movements, especially that one shark going from Monterey all the way down through Mexico and into the Sea of Cortez. That was really cool. My question, though, is where can we find the comic book next week when it's released?
So the Shark Lab website, if you go to the Shark Lab website and you go to the education page, there'll be a whole page there. And they're really cool. So you can actually download the link and you can scroll through the comic book like you have it in your hands. Yeah.
Great, cool. Thanks, June. Looks like Rick Starr is up next. Rick? Let's see.
Hey, Rick.
Rick? Rick, he's still muted.
He's been unmuted. I think maybe he doesn't hear us.
Oh.
I've asked to unmute him anyways.
Well, I see it's still muted, but he hasn't unmuted it yet. Well, while waiting for Rick, I actually have a question for you, Chris. You
Sure.
mentioned the seeing these things feed on the round stingrays. The sharks. Have you noticed if it's more during the day or night or any particular time of day, or is it
yeah, our drone surveys are only during the day. So that's the only time we've seen them. I'll be surprised if they're not feeding on them at night too. From our high resolution tracking data, we do see an uptick in activity during dawn and dusk. So we do see them moving a lot more during that period, at least faster. And then I didn't talk about the depth data, but within that high resolution array, we had 7 sharks with depth sensors on them. And we saw different, so basically during dawn and dusk, they're up more near the surface. And then during the midday, they're kind of moving up and down. Yeah. So we'll have some really nice 3D animations probably in the next few months.
I've probably told you this before, but we see them off Capitola. They're hanging out. You'll see them by these big bait balls of fish, and they're just hanging there, not doing anything. But at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, they tend to take off and move. Yeah. And move away from the coast. And the guys will tell you, like the guys in the helicopters, about 10, 11 in the morning, they come back. So I just a little dip, but they seem to move from what they've seen. Again, they're not flying at night, so they can't see anything, but they just see if they go earlier, they don't see them, or if after about 4 in a summer day, they tend not to see them either. They tend to move off. So just thought I'd pass it along.
Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me now, Chris?
Yeah, I got you, Rick.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself for some reason. It took a while for that to happen. So great talk. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I was interested in is kind of following up on what Dave just talked about. I was really fascinated to see your animations of water temperature driving those sharks. But what about these juveniles that we see up here all summer long? And, we have periods of wind where the water temperatures are cooling down and warming up. And we're in general, several degrees cooler than you are down there.
Yeah.
So do you think that this is a group of individuals who might be adapted to cooler water because they're probably a little larger? And do you think that they'll move relatively similarly, but in different water temperatures? Or have you, what are your thoughts on that?
So it's important that I clarify, Rick, that the data that I showed for those migrations were young of the year. So those are sharks that are less than, probably, they're less than 160 centimeters. So their mass is still pretty small. The sharks that we've seen round point conception and go into the colder California current water are all over 2 years old, which we put around 2 meters. So I think it's not until they get to be about 2 or 3 years old that they have sufficient mass to be able to tolerate the colder water. And it's weird, we're not really sure. Sal has, I think, some data showing that, they're probably doing some thermoregulation when they're really young. That's why the small ones are behaving that way. But the bigger ones, I think, are just simply more temperature tolerant. Their endothermy is more, they have higher thermal inertia, so they can withstand those cooler temperatures.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, I think Shelby.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was really fun to listen to. I was just curious, and I was having a little bit of internet glitching, so I might have missed it, but kind of tagging on the last couple questions, you showed that data of the sharks in the shallow coastal waters, and you said those are young of the year. Do you know if they're male or female?
They're mixed. So we do see a pretty much a 50-50 mix of males and females for the young of the year. When they get a little bit older, that may skew a tiny bit, but still not very far off. So we don't see like males in one place and females in the other. And as juveniles, that doesn't really surprise me. The bigger juveniles that we do see are mainly females. So the ones that are in the closer to 3 meter size, which we don't see a lot of along those areas, tend to be females. What's interesting to us is that those 2 and 3 meter sharks are acting like they did when they were 1.5 meters. So, you know, we're curious as to why would a 3 meter shark continue to use a nursery? So those are things that we don't understand yet, but so far we haven't seen any sex bias in anything.
Okay. I was just curious. I got to help out on some research in off the coast of South Africa. And what they were seeing was that some of the younger males, in particular in that like late afternoon, would come into the sandy shallows and just kind of like cruise around. And the way they described it was kind of like their man cave. It's where they disappeared to. So
maybe.
Curious. Thank you.
Sure.
You have any other questions for Chris? Anyone else? I don't see any other hands up. Anybody? No. I have another question, Chris. I'll ask you. What? Sure. Again, I've talked to you about this a little bit before, but one of the things I see up there, we see here in Monterey, is there's definitely a lot of size segregation. You know, if you're up around the cement boat, you tend to see these small sort of 6 to 8 footers. But if you go a couple miles down to Manresa Beach, then they're like the big ones, like 15, 16 feet long, which is also happens to be popular surf spots. I don't know if there's a relation between the surfers and the large ones, but do you see any of that similar in Southern California along the coast?
Well, not necessarily. So in the shores that are close to the beach, you know, like I say, the size range we see ranges from 1.5 meters to 3 meters. And they're all kind of within 200 meters of the shoreline. So what we're looking at our VPS data for, and I have a new postdoc that's going to start looking at, because we have 8 months of data for 35 individuals. And what he's going to start looking at to see if they're spatially, like, are the youngest ones in the shallowest water, and then the slightly bigger ones a bit further offshore. So he's going to start looking at that. And then, you know, we've got a couple other studies ongoing looking at social networks, because we are starting to see some community structuring, individuals kind of moving together and going to certain places together. I didn't go into that work because it's kind of, we're just in the beginning of doing those analyses. But they're going to be doing that in high resolution. And it'll be interesting to see if there's any size structuring spatially, you know, within those areas.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely interesting, those things, the way they segregate out once they start getting up there. Most sharks in general, but it's just real striking, just because you can literally like fly 2 miles down the coast and suddenly you don't see any small ones. They're all, and most of these are hanging out just in back of the breaker where the surfers are. They're just hanging out back there, and a lot of times we'll call in, like, give the heads up to the lifeguards. We're seeing some large sharks out there, but they're within a few hundred meters of the coast. They seem to just be cruising along during the day, almost like they're hanging out. Like they don't seem to be just sort of minding their own business during that time of the day.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, yeah. Do we have any other questions or comments for Chris? If we don't, we'll go ahead and just open it up here and have a bit of a virtual happy hour here. If you want to just ask Chris some questions and everything.